So I'm really pleased tonight to welcome you all here. I'm Keith, as I think everyone on this call knows, Dean of the Architecture Division here at CCA. And I'm really excited to have Kelly Bair and Kristy BairBalliet here tonight to present their lecture, Core Work. This is the last event in our fall Architecture Division lecture series. And I would like everyone to take note. If you would like to, you can hit the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom window to get a live transcript as the lecture progresses, or at any time. I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement. At CCA, we understand land acknowledgement as a transformative act meant to confront our place on native lands and build mindfulness of our present participation in colonial legacies. California College of the Arts campuses are located in Wuchin and Yelamu, also known as Oakland and San Francisco, respectively, on the unceded territories of the Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who have continuously lived upon this land since time immemorial. We recognize the historic discrimination and violence inflicted upon Indigenous peoples in California and the Americas, including their forced removal from ancestral lands and the deliberate and systematic destruction of their communities and culture. CCA honors Indigenous peoples past, present, and future here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you're joining us virtually today. If you'd like to learn more about CCA architecture, please visit scaffold.architecture.cca.edu, where you can find our lecture series schedule, watch videos of past events, and read stories by and about our students, faculty, and alumni. I'd now like to introduce our speakers. I first met and became familiar with Kelly and Kristy's work at a long ago ACSA conference, I think maybe 2014, 2015, something like that, in Toronto, in which they, along with Adam Fure and Kyle Miller, fellow UCLA MArch graduates, presented Possible Mediums, a collaborative effort, in their words, to shake up the context and format in which architecture is taught, produced, and engaged. It was an exciting moment to witness as they gathered a group of other young architects and academics who were speculating on alternative futures through an engagement with architecture's historical mediums and methods. In 2018, this work was published in the Possible Mediums book, which collected the work of the founders alongside that of their fellow travelers. Sometime after the start of the Possible Mediums project, I think, but before publishing the book, Kelly and Kristy founded BairBalliet, a joint design venture invested in architectural research that references the world around them and around us, leans on and into a long history of precedents, and imagines what lies ahead in the form of 2- and 3-dimensional built and speculative projects. Kelly is an associate professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago School of Architecture. She has also taught in Los Angeles at UCLA, SCI-Arc, and Woodbury. She holds a Bachelor of Environmental Design from University of Colorado and a master's degree from UCLA. Kristy is a member of the design faculty at SCI-Arc. Prior to co-founding BairBalliet, she was an associate professor at the Knowlton School at Ohio State and was assistant professor in Studio Greg Lynn at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. She's also taught at University of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia University. Kristy holds a Bachelor of Architecture from Philadelphia University and a master's degree from UCLA. BairBalliet's work has been exhibited internationally in the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale and at various locations around the US, including New York, at the Museum of Modern Art, Los Angeles at the Architecture and Design Museum and the SCI-Arc Gallery most recently, Detroit at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago at the Knight Gallery, and New Haven at the Yale University Gallery. In 2018, they were named finalists for the 2018 MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program. Please join me in welcoming Kelly and Kristy to CCA for their lecture, Core Work.
All right, thank you, Keith. Dean Cromwitty, I guess if we're being official. Thank you so much for the invite. Thank you to Sarah for working out the kinks with us and kind of getting all the logistics squared away. And of course, you know, we have a lot of friends watching and or listening, friends and colleagues. So thanks for tuning in. And then of course, the students, we really appreciate your time, especially as you head into final season. So hopefully you can maybe be productive on the side, given the Zoom format. But we're really honored to share the work with you. We've been kind of in the CCA family in various ways throughout the years. Kristy, I think, presented possible mediums there most recently, but I spent many times or many kind of final seasons traveling up and down the coast from LA to kind of see the student work there. And it was always really riveting. And, you know, I always really appreciated the kind of interdisciplinarity that happened within the kind of halls of your school. So we're really happy to share the work. As Keith mentioned, we are a partnership. I'm zooming in from Chicago. Kristy is zooming in from Los Angeles. The office, if I could just kind of advance the slide, the office is one that really no one can spell or pronounce. Spell check does not even really know what to do with us. It spell checks us to BairBalliet, which we really like, and we don't want to correct it. But we're going to hand the baton back and forth a couple of times today. We don't want to whiplash you, but I'm going to hand it over to Kristy just to kind of kick off the backstory of our office before we get into the work.
Do you want me to share, Kelly? Or are you gonna keep it?
Oh. I can run it.
Oh, perfect. Okay, great. So Kelly and I think Keith kind of summarized this a bit for us, but Kelly and I first met in graduate school at UCLA, but it was not until we both relocated to the Midwest for teaching positions in 2011, myself at Ohio State University in Columbus and Kelly, the University of Illinois in Chicago, that we began collaborating, initially as co-curators, along with Kyle Miller and Adam Fure of the Possible Mediums Project, and now as BairBalliet. In addition to PM, our previous individual practices, Central Standard Office of Design by Kelly and Balliet Studio by myself, offered a common yet distinctly separate playing field for us to begin building our practice in 2015. Kelly comes from a place that emphasizes profile. She has a preference for flatness and sharp, witty clarity. However, that clarity gives way to the unusual, typically through emergent three-dimensional formal traits that result from the abstraction of references. In her work, generic multiplicity yields specific oddities. For Kelly, the standards of architecture, how we draw, how we model, what we refer to, provide a point of origin for each project, with the final result moving further and further away from known methods.
And Kristy comes from a place that emphasizes volume. She believes that volume is authored, and this interest in volume attempts to move beyond the categorization of space as a passive thing to control, and instead asks volume to perform. She prefers excess and has a predilection for the difficult. Her obsession to expose interiority results in a sensibility that's wrought with expansive qualities, where telescopic enfilades unfold and multiple subjectivities are engaged. Together as BairBalliet, we work to merge these independent proclivities to produce something other, something that's neither purely profile nor volume, but somewhere between and ultimately beyond either individual pursuit. We've titled this lecture Core Work, and as a preamble, we'll look at the more common definition, at least within architecture, of core, and then redefine the term through the lens of our office. We'll start with this slide, which I think we could all agree finds its kind of identity within the term core. First, as a kind of architectural element or a series of core architectural elements, maybe the most obvious being a kind of circulation core that moves one vertically up through a series of floors of a building. Or we might look at this image as a kind of foundational idea, as in a core curriculum. But we also really like this image, which is a recent image by the queer architect. And I think we can maybe align ourselves with this in many ways, in the sense that we can think of core as a sample, almost in a geologic sense, a kind of sample or a cross-section of space and time that encapsulates some of architecture's most ambitious moments. So a form of architectural reduction in its most potent form. And so here, this is an image of obviously Corb's Maison Domino mashed up with Hans Vollein's travel agency. And here, I think we can see, you know, the kind of trading of structure for effect. The kind of, if one were to sample a moment in this particular image or in this project, this proposal, one would, along with the kind of conventional, let's say, elements of architecture, would also be able to kind of pull the effects and the context related to the travel agency within, and sort of understand it within that particular sample. And so what began as a kind of negotiation between the two of us as autonomous designers developed into an office with a body of work that embraces as well as redefines this term core. So for our office, body work, or a kind of body of work, is the habitual and continued pursuit of architectural design, punctuated by research topics that push the boundaries of design methodology and the consumption of its artifacts. And so here, in its kind of most basic understanding, we understand the work as falling under this definition of core as our body of work, with these reoccurring themes that support both past, present, and future work. And then we also think of it as, you know, a core group of people, but ones who bring specific expertise to a particular project. So our office model is one where it's always Kristy and I, but our office might kind of grow or shrink, and also do that in various locations. So sometimes the office is bigger in LA and smaller in Chicago, and then we will flip that. So it's a very kind of project specific booting up of the office that looks to a particular expertise with our team as we kind of grow and shrink. This is, we call this the family tree, and it's a lineage of work that's both chronological and conceptually evolutionary. The projects to date are diverse in their scope and medium, yet are bound by their focus on the betweens, a diagnosis perhaps traceable to the negotiations happening between two partners in distant cities across multiple sites, and further disseminated to various audiences. The family tree illustrates two major workouts, and these workouts are identified in the white boxes with the black text. We've taken these on in the office starting at about in 2015, 2016, when we started our practice. And we see these workouts as an exercise in research that becomes the umbrella under which projects, shown in the black boxes with white text, fall. Each project engages on some level with our notion of a core as both a thing, an object, a building, a prop, and an act, a process, a format, and a mode of communication. In our opinion, no doubt, a self-reflective reading of our work, this produces two types of cores, not opposing, yet differentiated in their approach to design, a both and condition. In both cases, we maximize design with minimal means to produce full wholes that are deliberately incomplete. So maybe just to kind of elaborate a bit more on these two really design processes is what it comes down to. The first that we identify as full wholes is a design methodology that coalesces references into potent concentrations of architectural effects. And these effects occur within a small footprint and or with limited mass, volume, and material. And then subsequently, this produces a kind of what we see as a dense spatial territory achieved with an economy of means. One example is this collection of study models for our recent No More Room exhibition that asks a single core, an object in space, to oscillate between object and backdrop, interior and exterior, and mass and volume. Another example is a film we produced for a gallery in Chicago called the Night Gallery. The film is called Another Rear Window, and we scramble the conventional relationship between camera, scene, and audience in an effort to expand the thinness of the screen that comes between them into a deeply spatial and uncannily familiar realm. Or here in a model we call the shelf, produced for a drawing exhibition titled The Computational Image, a show where we contribute VR drawn models as a stand-in for the ubiquitous image, a project we called Graphic Line Object, or GLOW for short. Here we riff on IKEA's best-selling storage plank, the lack shelf, where we imply its original proportions through thick lines as opposed to a thin laminated surface. In a second model for the same exhibition, a plaque that is formalized through the inverse imprint of the object it displays suggests a symbiosis rather than a hierarchy between the background canvas and the design object that's on display. And lastly, a model that we call for the same show, same exhibition, that we call the Weave, a nod to 1970s tapestries where we trade color for texture, formally tangle a mess of thick lines, and embed a mirror as a means to both deepen the space of the mass, as well as reflect the image of the viewer back onto themselves. Perhaps not computational, but image producing nonetheless. And then this second kind of mode of operation that we tend to kind of revisit in the office is something that we talk about as incomplete wholes. And this is a kind of design methodology that is, I think we could maybe tie it back to the geology setup that I set up in the Maison Domino slide, which is a kind of active core sampling that redacts and distills content into new forms of architecture. And this is an architecture that evokes a partial or incomplete construction of a yet to be in the world spatial realm. One example of this is a moment within our PS1 proposal called Loud Lines, where a collection of dashed lines intersect and are designed to produce an atmosphere of pulsating light and liquid effects within the negative space of the pipes, effects derived from missing material. Or here in a play area designed for children, where wall partition becomes pliable climbing structure and stair becomes a soft base of foam for landing, removing their conventional roles of visual obstruction and vertical circulation and opening them up to childlike impromptu interpretations and uses beyond their architectural stereotypes. Or lastly, a built project for the Boys and Girls Club of Los Angeles, where surfaces are color blocked with figural planes to suggest space without matter, reconfiguring an existing space into many and asking visitors to fill in the blanks. So tonight we'll present 5 projects in full that make a case for cores and further illustrate how we define them.
Awesome. This is our major shift of the night.
The time passed.
Yeah. Are you seeing that full screen, Kelly?
Yep.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you for the setup and for launching. I'm going to dive us into the first of the 5 projects that we're going to show tonight. And the first project that we'll show is the first project that we also did as BairBalliet. It's titled The Next Port of Call, and it was commissioned by Monica Ponce-de-Leon and Cynthia Davidson, curators of the 2016 Venice Biennale, and exhibited alongside 11 other US architecture firms that year in the US Pavilion. We were given a rather vast site, 26 acres, situated between the Detroit River to the south and to the north, an industrial district mixed with a rapidly gentrifying residential neighborhood called Corktown. The site also included a post office, 1 million square foot of late 50s modernism sitting atop a plinth, offering both a potential platform for viewing the river and at the same time presenting a barricade to the neighborhood for viewing and accessing both the river and the large public park that should come beyond it. For us, the site was like many others in Detroit. It exemplified the tenuous relationship between the built and unbuilt that the city is infamous for. In Detroit, scale or perceived depth is a funny thing. Due to the high vacancy rates, we were privy to a we are privy to a different relationship to buildings in two unique ways. First, we experience buildings in the round. All elevations are exposed, making relationships like front and back and side ambivalent towards its subject. And second, we look through or between buildings, beyond our immediate context and towards a seemingly flat city beyond. Depth and distance factor into this perception in very different ways than most typical urban centers. Knowing the future plans for densifying Detroit, we looked for ways to preserve these unusual spatial experiences in our proposal. This meant that a singular monolithic building scheme was out of the question. Instead, the project developed a strategy of multiplicity and composition, many buildings situated to highlight the spaces in between as much as the buildings themselves. The interstitial zones that were frequently neglected or simply left over, interior courts, porticos, and plazas that enhance civic life, were here in this project placed in direct dialogue with building mass. These two elements, solid and void, populate the park in an orchestrated yet casual composition. The project formalizes this idea about multiple fronts. We can see this in Albert Kahn's 1922 GM headquarters, tied at the base with a plinth, but free to expose its many faces in its split tower. The building became one of several from Detroit's architectural history that we gave a nod to. To develop a formal strategy, we composited iconic Detroit profiles of various scales and types, allowing us to sample and abstract characteristics as well as exaggerate elements. We developed a taxonomy of building types from which new profiles were designed and arranged on planimetric circles of varying size and distances from one another within the park. At the same time, we were building another taxonomy, an analytical one, as opposed to the more projective one that I just described, around architectural elements that have historically challenged our perception of dimensional bigness and visual depth. Plinths, as mass relates to the ground, or parapets, as mass relates to the sky, and partial walls, as mass relates to void, all elements that highlight the qualities of what we now define as incomplete. We were charged by the curators with keeping some aspect of the post office. So Kelly and I initially proposed a 45-degree shear to the side facing the river. This shear transformation, paired with the insertion of large, incomplete volumes that intersected the facade, transformed the overall mass from a solid wall to now a thick threshold. Where volumes meet planar facade and the building itself is literally cut away to expose an interior. While designed in the round, each building reveals their spatial qualities through moments of disruption, where two-dimensional profiles and surface edges produce planar breaks in an otherwise three-dimensional circular sequence. These disruptions expose the building's section to the exterior, implying spatial continuity despite physical separation. And while this was a speculative project where the primary output was an exhibition, including models and drawings. So for us, it was really important to think about not just designing the project, but to also designing the collection of representation that were paired with it. So we riffed on Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights as a means to present the drawings as both autonomous as well as part of a larger narrative. This allowed us to make divisions between an overwhelming quantity of visual information within the project while maintaining consistency between panels through color, texture, material, and detail. By dividing up a complex site of 14 buildings into 4 zones, we looked for balance between areas of heavy detail and zones of pure white or light hatch. So using several techniques for the drawings, such as cropping and color and tone, allowed the panels to read both singularly as a set. So here at the dock and the inlet, stereotomic lines both track relationships between opposing profiles and figure the space between the buildings. Program is also a drawing layer, described through lines of trajectory implying movement, organization, and scale. Intentional cropping of other zones adjacent to the picture frame establishes a specific narrative for each panel while offering a constructed continuity between each one. And a shift from the elevation oblique to the worm's eye oblique shifts the setting of the project's representation from the exterior to the interior, revealing volumetric cuts into the existing building and the underlying geometry of their construction. In 2018, we were selected as finalists for the MoMA PS1 Young Architects program that was mentioned earlier. For approximately 20 years, the program has now ended. Architects competed to develop a proposal for the courtyard of the MoMA PS1 branch in Queens. The courtyard and installation hosted and engaged thousands of summer visitors as part of their annual DJ warm-up sessions. We decided to title this project Loud Lines. Riffing on Robin Evans, who famously stated that architects do not make buildings, they make drawings of buildings, we decided to flip that, and we proposed that architects make a building of drawings. So in this instance, BairBalliet was inviting MoMA and summer visitors to PS1 to inhabit a drawing and to live a life within Loud Lines. For this project, Loud Lines reimagines a new way to inhabit the courtyard. It challenged the PS1 paradigm, which tends to fall into one of two categories, either a canopy or an object. And instead, it drew the perimeter, making a canopy. And instead of drawing the perimeter and making a canopy or placing an object, we proposed frames, a composition of lines that oscillate between the two. By drawing the main courtyards, a triangle and a rectangle, first two-dimensionally, and then generating volume, the shapes were then rotated and materialized, effectively creating two space frames that intertwine. Lines are used in two primary ways in this project. First, as frames, creating large, visually porous space frames for visitors to see and be seen. And second, as a surface, creating a dense canopy for maximum shade in the smaller courtyard. The third element in the project is a shallow wading pool. In this project, Loud Lines was making room, or it was making rooms. Here you can see each room or volume encourages different types of activities. For example, the hideout, a small space that offers escape from the eye of the crowd, or the boardwalk, where visitors cruise the strip from entry to stage, or the makeout corner, a medium-sized room tucked away into the corner. The project was meant to sort of define volume as well as generate it. And in terms of how the project would be proposed, we proposed using, in terms of building this system, we proposed a robust system where the abstract lines are materialized using HDPE large diameter rigid pipe. These pipes are typically used for water management, but in terms of fabrication, small pellets are melted into liquid material that is extruded and die formed into a solid. This had a nice connection for us to the previous research that we did in terms of Loud Lines that Kelly showed in the GLOW project related to the drawing of lines through virtual reality, where the customization of the thickness of the material was one that could be easily manipulated. For this project, we proposed a range of diameters from 12 inches to 60 inches. And we selected the double wall type with a smooth interior and a corrugated exterior for its texture and structural capacity. Your experience would have changed based on your proximity to the elements and the time of day. The pipes were strategically hit the ground to accommodate long benches, approximately 100 linear feet of seating. And the pipes can also be cut with a basic saw and heat seamed for standard mitered connections. However, more complex intersections would have been robotically cut. To that end, there were two types of end caps. The standard cap would have been vacuum formed out of plastic, and 4 to 5 custom caps of fiberglass would have added structural robustness when needed and design nuance intersections into the system. The intersections were designed to casually sit on the wall, peek over the edge, and reach high into the air, contributing to their flickering quality between line and object. As you approach the site, the project has the intentional role of being designed as both foreground and background. And as you enter into the courtyard to begin your day within Loud Lines, you enter the courtyard first through an encounter with a part of the project that we see as being both very full, but also incomplete. For the next project, I'm going to talk a little bit more closely to the relationship of cores that Kelly set up in the beginning. In many ways, the story of cores starts with the middle. In 2018, we were obsessed with middles, primarily the absence of them. Similar to previous projects, for example, the next port of call that I just presented, we moved away from the singular building in favor of a collection of buildings. There, it was about the ploys of scale and appearance and how things are not quite as they appear. In that project, we looked at this question through plinths, bottoms, partial walls, often middle, but sometimes bottom and top, and parapets, always top. And this project, No Middle Mid-Rise, revisited our fascination with the role of tops, middles, and bottoms, but this time redacting the middle. In terms of redaction, redaction is a two-dimensional visual technique that masks out selected information. Here in these precedent studies, we used redaction to place emphasis on the top and bottom, where buildings negotiate the sky and the ground. A building with no middle is like pulling your hat over your face or pulling your tube socks up to your waist, or even better, vice versa, or with your pants on your head. In other words, intentionally making the scene incomplete. And another ambition of this project, as we were working through it within the office, was to work on cores while challenging extrusion, a common trope of cores. So for this project, these cores have the potential to accentuate their relationship to the ground, a bit of a weeble wobble, reliant on a stabilizing bottom, or accentuate their relationship with the sky with the use of an inverted colonnade. In terms of the rib development, here we riffed on the earlier loud line research. The building could be a volumetric line at one scale, the loudest of lines, or rather a set of quiet lines. In terms of the plans, they offered a look at the composition of an interior with no corners and varied relationships with perimeter enclosures. Access is now provided from the perimeter and at upper levels. The front door expands beyond the elevator doors and associated lobbies. Here, the entire floor is the lobby. As started in the early 2000s and accelerated even more in the last year, the office building continues to be rethought from every angle, from how we work, why we work, and where we work. Does anyone even really remember WeWork? The implications of how we arrive, how long we stay, move through, and depart buildings are examined as we reimagine the multiplication of thresholds and viewing windows within the city. Building access and transition volumes, such as porte cocheres, lobbies, and circulation cores, are now disrupted throughout the building, offering vertical ports of entry embedded at all levels, rather than limited to the ground floor. Facades are animated by the constant hum of arrivals and departures. Flight paths participate in the frontal elevation as it's hot-wired to electrify the void between the building masses. Seen here in these isolated elevation of the core buildings, each floor or designated floors could have a potential port and address beyond the X and Y. In No Middle Mid-Rise is made up of 3 types of parts. First, the cores or drums, 2 volumetric vessels that contain office and public space. And 2, the skirt, a plinth-like mass that anchors the now liberated ground plane. And 3, the legs, vertical circulation cores that unite the distributed ports to the city. Transforming the conventional 3 parts of building, the project lifts the bottom and stretches the top downward, effectively rendering the middle and the repetitive uninterrupted center of a mid-rise now obsolete. And for one of our workouts, as we often do in the office, in the summers, we make intentional shifts, another form of the body work that Kelly referenced earlier in our office tree. This time we shifted from redacting the middle to making it the focus. The shift corresponded with our desire to rethink the core and consider the role of the stable and unstable in architecture. To consider this issue, it made sense for us to start with the home, a place that we often consider as maybe the core architectural type. We started by looking at what holds it all together, its core. The core of a house, though, as we started to research it from our point of view, is something that can migrate. It's sometimes located at the geographic center and other times assigned based on value or a particular role, such as a hearth, a stair, or a courtyard. And of course, there is a double meaning. A core sample in both a geological and architectural terms maps time and spatial layers. So in order to look at this more intently, we dove into cores. 22 core samples were extracted from homes built between 1750 and 2009, spanning the compartmentalized 4 square to the open plan. And in terms of another body work that was sort of happening in parallel to that core sample analysis was research project we called the Unstable Image. The project was born from 3 observations. 1, culturally, it was mainly based on sort of social media, or looking at an observation related to social media. In disciplinary, the emergence of the image as an architectural problem, and professional. At the time, our clients, probably still are, were obsessed with HGTV, before and after remodels, and Wayfair, shop the look visualization interface. It was developed through written text, tested in workshops with students and office staff, and informal design exercises between Kelly and I. As a research project, it learned from the cores analysis and began by assembling disparate cores together in order to produce the spatial equivalent of quantum mechanics. Stripped of materiality, their formal logics, and total unawareness of their context, the samples are ambiguous to their attitude towards interiority and exteriority. Viewed frontally, they oscillate between continuity and disruption, suggesting we might be in 2 or more spaces at the same time. And certainly steeped in representational process, though processes more related to film and set design than architecture, at least to start, this particular design exercise uses the Instagram story transition interface as a software to transpose digital model images of disparate core samples. Here, a scene diagram establishes the relationship of characters in the choreography of their locations related to both front, middle, and back, as well as in the round. Green screen techniques are employed in an attempt to converge a centralized 3D core sample, static 2-dimensional projection planes, and rotating Instagram transition cubes. At its core, the unstable image is both a representational act of viewing architecture, as well as a tool for designing spatial occupation that is both subjective and objective simultaneously.
Inspired by, make sure I'm unmuted. Inspired by the unstable image research, House of Cores is our first smaller scale project rooted in the domestic realm. We found fellow travelers in the form of Morphosis's 2468 house, also in Charles Moore Arinda house and Diller and Scafidio's withdrawing room. And we sort of strain these through our, let's say, our core methodology. And so we saw 2468 as kind of core as room, Arinda house, core as column, and then in Diller and Scafidio's withdrawing room, the split core is kind of referring back to the unstable image research that Kristy set up. House of Cores is situated in the semi-urban neighborhood of Venice, California, surrounded by traditional Southern California bungalows. The house encourages multiple scenarios for domestic living and working, renting and owning, present and future, and challenges the longstanding notion of mine and yours by fostering core migration both within a single lot line as well as across it. In our culture's constant search for perfection, a range of social, political, and cultural forces points to a history of addition and subtraction for the house typology, with core both internal and expelled. Today, the ability to accumulate and purge offers multiple options for redefining how one or many live. This replica of the game perfection imagines the migrancy of cores across a neighborhood and their interchangeability with regard to owner, user, and program. Interrogating cores, the literal and conceptual point that holds a house together, requires one to pull it apart, spatially, formally, materially, and programmatically. In House of Cores, cores are loosely stitched back together with a porous ring, shown here in pink, that vacillates between having the appearance of barely containing them to nearly fully absorbing them. From the front, House of Cores plays by the proportions set forth in the neighborhood roof lines, contrasting only through its geometry, though with a nod to the sloped pitch of the surrounding bungalows. And from the alley, the ring is revealed, fronted by a carport that follows the height line established by adjacent roof lines. The plans reveal a leaky relationship between ring and cores, a reversal of the indexical massing and material delineation visible from the outside. Walls are cut away at the interior, allowing for continuous circulation and programmatic ambiguity. The four cores are extracted here, illustrating their programmatic potentials and their scale shifts. So the first one is the largest core that offers sleeping, living, and bathing for one or several. The next is a medium-sized core that functions as an ADU or an extension of the larger core's programs, kind of overflow. And then the small, what we identify as the small, is a core for dining with an office on top that offers a kind of sectional overlap of pleasure and work. And then lastly, an extra small core with an extra large roof used for exercise or storage with an attached carport tucked under the roof plane. And then here, a kind of view from inside the medium core looking out towards the courtyard. And lastly, a view from the courtyard looking back towards the large and medium cores, where we have little acknowledgement to the external context. And then returning just to the front view for a moment, we see that House of Cores is oriented rather traditionally to the street-facing facade. A related project that we're currently working on and that we see as a form of one of the perfection pieces that spun off the main house is shown in the perfection diagram, is an ADU that we call Writer's Block, located in Studio City, California. Here we see the rear yard prioritized as it acts as the hinge between the existing house and the auxiliary programs that spill out of it. Contextually, it's nested between the existing house and the neighbor's privacy walls. The project in many ways, sorry, I'll come back to that. The project in many ways merges geometric languages in House of Cores, though flips their ratios in terms of standard and bespoke forms. Writer's Block is designed to maximize standard framing, so about 75% of the building relies on standard framing, while the other 25% is built from low-cost framing kits with moments of large-scale digital fabrication put to use for finishes, trim, and door and window components. And these fall more in line with the scale of furniture than architecture. In this case, the programs are distinct, yet coexist within and around the building block. And I'll go back, sorry. Forgot to switch these around. So for example, a space for a screenplay writer with a writing loft and a screening room down below kind of coexist or are adjacent to a garden area with pool storage and exterior dining. Exterior forms emerge from the main body of the house, which we call the block. And this is kind of referring to the kind of standard framing moment of the project, acting as partial backdrops for activities such as dining, gardening, and swimming, yet do the traditional work of semi-coverage, so awnings, coves, and entry landings. The last project that we'll show tonight was our recent exhibition in the SCI-Arc Gallery titled No More Room. Under the influence of the unstable image, on the coattails of House of Cores, and converging sharply with the rise of the pandemic, the exhibition took on a combinatorial design approach that was less about abstraction and more about intensification. The emphasis on not many, but one single design core, seen here on the right in white, forced a dialogue between an architecture of the incomplete and the constructed world necessary to fill it out. An approach to filling a gallery that's a potential antidote to the scarcity of means that often come with these types of design exhibitions. In this series of study models for the core, we see the semblances of elements we know: walls, soffits, columns, parapets, ceilings, floors, etc. Conceived of as the core sample taken at the convergence of multiple implied rooms, the zones of each core are independent of one another, yet seemingly aware as geometries are traced around, across, and through the circumference of the object, as seen here in these unfolded elevations. Reliant on and completed by multiple subjects, perceptions, and associations, No More Room redefines the spatial and experiential limits of a gallery. It leverages the contemporary relationship between the rooms we inhabit and the images we consume to produce a sense, as Kristy put it, of being in multiple spaces at once, a type of quantum superimposition in architectural terms. It's a layered construction of volumetric relationships centered around the designed core sample. In the gallery, the project aims at the perception of fullness over literally filling it with matter. There are minimal material objects, one core and 3 blue screen walls that expand and contract the space of the gallery through effect. Geologic in nature, the core represents a partial architecture embedded with information from many points of origin and melds their traits to find completeness in the round. It has backgrounds and middle grounds to foreground spatial experiences. Cultural production pivots during unstable moments, often utilizing fragments to reflect the fragility of our environment. However, No More Room prefers an architecture of the incomplete to an excessive reconstruction of parts, so absence over decom. Leveraging our aptitude for habitual cropping, framing, and construction of one's world that merges our physical thresholds and virtual realms, a core sample is employed as both a process and a product here. The core is also both an object and a backdrop. As an object, its base sits unsteadily on the ground, reaching up to reveal its roofline only at the building exterior. As a backdrop, it leverages muteness, allowing overlays of various associations as opposed to specific architectural elements. Core sampling produces an inherent outside from insides, making it both an interior volume and an exterior mass. A design core is a projective act that renders walls obsolete as it reveals unforeseen relationships between rooms. Formal negotiation is favored over extrusion and challenges the notion that the core is a vertical connection between floors or a geometric center between rooms. No More Room represents a collection of spatial intensities at the intersection. Blue screen walls, devices normally used to project a limitless and immersive environment, are misused. Here, edges are exposed, highlighting the potential zone between one world and the next. As an alternative to full immersion, surfaces meant to be invisible in order to complete a scene instead are objects that redact and replace visual content. The exhibition is a partial construction and a finished stage set designed for viewing in multiple states. A split screen aesthetic broadcasts the physical side in the form of a live feed surveillance video on the left, and its virtual side through animated content on the right. The choreography between the point of view of the physical camera, the point of view of the digital camera vis-a-vis rendered imagery, and the physical matter constructed in the gallery yield a sense of being in between for both in real life and virtual visitors. And even for Kristy and I here in this screenshot, as we occupy the space of the gallery on opening night in separate yet related ways, Kristy in real life in the gallery and Kelly virtually from her bedroom in Chicago through chroma key effects. And just to close, I'm going to switch over, and this will be our kind of background for questions or conversation, to the website that we produced for the show. So the website is still live, and you can visit. I can put the link in the chat if you want to have a longer view. It's meant to be a kind of slow and meditative clip on the right. But what you're seeing here is the third episode of the run of show. So we designed and let's say produced 3 different clips essentially that could be viewed on the website. And this is the last one that was up as the show closed. But maybe just to close out a bit more formally, well, the term core has been used specifically to design and produce more recent work in the office. We find its conceptions in the early body of work, making it a kind of bedrock of our office ethos, a pursuit towards an architecture that is productively contradictory, a both and, flat and full, interior and exterior, and one and many. So we'll leave this up. And we are happy to engage in questions. This is actually Kristy's favorite part of any lecture. She really excels at it.
True. Well, I don't know if I excel at it, but the Q&A is definitely my favorite part.
Yeah.
Thank you, Kristy. Thank you, Kelly. So you can unmute yourself. I think that's possible for everyone, and ask a question, because we won't be able to see your hand since we're looking at this amazing work. Or you can use the chat for a question. And thank you, Kristy, for posting the link.
Yeah, I posted the link to the website, which has episode 3, which was the final episode playing. So you could, meditate to that. I also put a link to our website specific to this project where you can look at all 3 episodes if you'd like.
Awesome. Thank you. That was really, I don't think I've actually seen you two present your project as BairBalliet. So that was fun to see it. And I have an immediate question, which is maybe an obvious question as we wait for others maybe to raise their virtual hands. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on your audiences. The work is deeply an investigation of architectural methods, drawing methods, architectural. Ask me to share my video. Oh, maybe the host is bringing me up so you can see me. So I'm not a disembodied voice. But it's so, clearly an investigation into architecture itself. What was it? Line and volume. I think if I can go all the way back to the start and sort of your your interest, I won't get psychoanalytic on you, but perhaps like your personalities, like merging into this, bare bellies or bare belly. But I'm wondering how you understand audience engagement with the work. And I think maybe this last project is a good one to talk about this with, but both a disciplinary audience, which I think is pretty clear, but a sort of a non-disciplinary audience. You know, your ideas about perception of the projects visually, experience of the project spatially and atmospherically, because I think what is so compelling to me is that there is a kind of oscillation between a kind of graphic formulation and a kind of spatial atmospheric formulation in the work. So I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Keith. Thank you. I guess I feel like I want to answer it in two different ways. I think one is maybe the audiences that we know, which is, I think that one is probably super obvious, and you indicated it, the discipline of architecture that I think Kelly and I are both invested in, both within our practice, but also both Kelly and I are incredibly invested in teaching at each of our institutions, and are, I think, responsible for large chunks of curriculum, et cetera. So I think that as a practice that sort of moves between academia and out in the world, I definitely think we think the audience of our students and our peers is incredibly important, and one that we'd like to sort of push and develop that conversation with. But on the other hand, I think that there is the audience of the client work, which is not what we showed a lot of tonight. I think we hinted at the sort of Hive project in Chicago, which was a co-working space with a children's play space attached, or a kind of a project for the Boys and Girls Club here in Los Angeles that we did at the same time that we were working on this exhibition. And actually, I was thinking, Kelly, we should show a slide with those two together, because I think that at the same time, Keith, that we were sort of working on this project and sort of thinking about how do you fill this space and sort of define multiple volumes within this singular rectangular room. We were sort of working with the Boys and Girls Club to kind of renovate one of their classrooms into like a maker space. And limited resources in terms of how to create and move a singular classroom into a space that could sort of host almost have like multiple rooms within one room at one time, where they're doing kind of workshops and things like that. So that one's maybe certainly is less fleshed out certainly in this lecture, and I would say even in our practice at large, in terms of how we shift and think about an audience that is the kind of client side of things. Although I think that aspect is certainly increasing. Like, what does it mean to communicate to a client how you can take a singular space and make it into multiple spaces, right? What does that mean functionally for them? What does that mean in terms of being able to have multi-purpose spaces, in terms of being able to have, flexibility, which are things, I think, terms that maybe clients would use, which would be, similar outputs of a project that's sort of working to develop rooms within rooms, which from like a disciplinary point of view would have a different audience or a different way of talking about it. But I think in terms of putting a space into the world that can be used in multiple ways at the same time, I think ideally that's talking to multiple audiences, not to overuse the word multiple there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that there's also maybe a weird way in which we approach the order of operations of things. So I think in a maybe more traditional like client architect relationship, the onus would be on the architect to kind of teach the disciplinary, or explain and teach the disciplinary bits of architecture to the client, to sort of like bring them to our side. And I think what's really interesting, I think, about like the whole beginning of the unstable image work, which really led into these last series of projects and fueled them in some pretty extreme ways, was really us like leaning into these relatively, I don't want to say like naive, but like not in the know modes of looking at architectural spaces or interiors that our clients were actually bringing to us. Now, whether or not the client gets looped in, to this project at the end, and they become an audience for this work, or whether they remain the kind of, let's say, the genesis for this work, I think maybe remains to be seen. But it really became kind of generative for us to take seriously that audience and the kind of cultural moment at that time that we were in and are still in. Oddly, that was the whole kind of split screen aesthetics research started right before the pandemic. And of course, Kristy and I, being in different locations, we were already in this world quite often, but it suddenly became everyone's world right about the time that we were really kind of getting invested in that research.
Yeah, I appreciate those answers, and I'm still left with kind of like a but. So I'll put it out there. I think the split screen thing is really fascinating because it actually, it's a way through which you're engaging a kind of new orders of spatiality, new conditions of a kind of 2D, 3D oscillation of a kind of situating ourselves, right? Even as we're then like looking at those things on screens in some entirely different space. But in terms of the disciplinary audience, fellow architects, your students, super important, and as practitioners and architects and as teachers, I mean, we're constantly sort of translating the work that we do to our audience of young architects, right? That we engage in the studio. And then there's a client, and I think one could, to different degrees, argue that the client is almost a co-author of the work, for any architect, whether that is acknowledged or suppressed, whatever the situation is. But there are inputs coming from the client. I'm thinking about a public, right? Like, because with the Venice project in Detroit, again, there was a public that was a disciplinary public, but the project aimed for engagement with a public, which was, residents in Detroit in that place. Or with the houses in Venice, right? Now, the public in Venice is also a kind of, I think one could safely say, while not being an inside audience, has engagement with a lot of weird architecture, because Venice is, its own little petri dish of stuff happening.
There's a history. Yeah.
There's a history there. And I guess I'm thinking about the work in this moment where we're all questioning, like, the boundaries of architecture, who architecture has not served historically, audiences that we've ignored, histories that we've neglected or, willfully, suppressed and marginalized. Because I think the work, even as like grounded as it is in the history of architecture as an architect's history of architecture, still opens up space and kind of readings for, let's say, an uninitiated audience. I don't know that I'm really asking you a question anymore. I'm basically sort of interrogating what you're doing. But it's super fascinating to me because I think, like you and like when you were at UCLA in that moment, and like, all the people that you've like bounced ideas off of, and, some in the room here or maybe on the phone here, myself, really like deeply knowledgeable about the history of architecture, super engaged, looking for sort of material that can continually be reworked, right? It's like a wellspring of stuff, but there's this ocean of stuff that we ignore. And that ocean of stuff is what frames people's capacity to perceive, use, navigate built environments.
Right.
Yeah, I think that I guess the other way, well, first of all, I think part of my response is just like, note it, like, yes, like I hear you. And I think that it's something that we are kind kind of continuing to work on to sort of expand our engagement with broader audiences. I would say up until this point, though, the way that I think we have been interested in engaging sort of audiences outside of students and outside of clients would be, I think, through the lens of working on architecture through a set of sort of conventions that then get sort of, in some instances, sort of subtly or slightly modified, and in other instances, much more robust or major changes are happening. And I think our thought was, even if we think back to the Detroit project, we did, as did all groups, sort of have to meet, we met the audience of Detroit long before we met the audience of the Biennale. And I think that it was, became clear to us is in a site like that, it was important to begin to be able to incrementally give development, right? And so our plan was, instead of doing a singular massive block on the site, that we could sort of, by rolling out these sort of small scale buildings that could be sort of seem complete on their own, even though they were designed to be completed by other buildings, could do two things to a broader audience, I think, which would be, over time, if these things landed on that site, it wouldn't feel like they were waiting for 10 years for this project to be finished, which is often how a plan of that scale, 12 acres in a site like that, would happen. But instead, each time one would be designed incomplete, such that it seemed complete. I don't know if that answers, so that's sort of one way that we were sort of interested in, sort of like, even if only 2 of those of 14 got built, they would sort of be in communication with the other buildings in the adjacent neighborhoods, right? So that was one way to think about it. The other way to think about it was, when we were talking with them, that they were all coming from neighborhoods that had, almost had that ratio of construction, where they had 1 building and then 2 empty lots, 1 building and 2 empty lots. And in some ways, the thought was, if they were to, visit this park, so it was meant to be sort of a park with different facilities within it, they then could maybe go back into the city and see the city differently. And I don't think that would require any architectural knowledge in order to do that. But it was sort of a project that I think was sort of acknowledging an architectural ratio that already existed in neighborhoods, which were seen as missing something, and instead designing a project where it's sort of like, from an architecture point of view, was designed to miss something, but from a broader public audience, it might make you feel like a certain density was on purpose. I don't know if that's fair.
No, I love that. I love that. Mark Donahue has a question.
Hi, thanks for your
Hello.
talk. It was excellent. Love to see the work. And I think you folks weren't here, or I know Kelly, I think you were here not too long ago, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe I'm just.
Kristy more recently than I think for a possible mediums event.
Probably it.
Yeah.
But as Keith was pointing out, to have the 2 of you, perfection. So I'm curious now that as you're moving more towards the construction of these projects, and it's exciting to see that for sure, and especially the projects in Venice. I put something out there. I said, maybe I'm misquoting these at this point, but there's I remember someone reading it or finding it somewhere where might be, he talked about it with clients, is there be good reasons for doing things or real reasons for doing things? And I think, I find myself caught on that fence all the time. How much do you let people into the world you're interested in and talking about in architecture versus the ways you can talk with clients to get things built? And I'm curious about it just for helping the students talk about that. I know I talk with my students a lot about that as well, because I think we in the academia have a particular way of discussing the work, but how do you loop the client into that to get them on your side of the table to actually do something? I'm curious how you've been getting into that more and more these days. And I'll take the answer offline.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think maybe it applies a little bit to the comment I made before, in the sense that we often find it you know, a bit difficult to, it can become a bit opaque if we go in with this level of disciplinarity. So I think, you know, with a lot of the work, we actually kind of try to lean into to their modes and I would even say like stereotypical notions of architecture, and actually kind of work with those in a way. I think that I don't know, maybe the more recent like Venice project, and then the subsequent one that I showed with it, those are projects, as Keith mentioned, because of their location. There's a kind of more liberal attitude, I think, or acceptance of trying some new things. And so I think those two projects, I mean, one is the House of Cores one is speculative. The smaller kind of writer's block one has a real client. But I think that they're set within a context where there isn't a whole lot of talking into things necessarily. Though I do think we have to rely on a certain level of visualization that might be different than in representation than what we, you know, might show in Venice, for example. And so, you know, you can maybe see the shift that starts to happen, especially in terms of just like citing things in a realistic way, right? Or a slightly more realistic way, so that they can almost, I don't know, so it's already in the world in a way.
Yeah, I think I would just add to that, Mark, because I think the Studio City example maybe is it, again, maybe we didn't make that explicit in the lecture, but like the House of Cores is more of a research project from our side, coming from that game perfection, sort of leaning on the issues I think that are certainly happening in Los Angeles with everyone needing to sort of densify their lots with sort of additional housing. But when we move to the sort of Studio City site with the client, they're like, we could just put a rectangle here, right? We could just put it like a garage, and I could write on the upstairs, and we could put a little theater on the downstairs, which is true. And so we sort of leaned into that in terms of the footprint. But then they also, and this is maybe to the students and maybe to your question, they also were like, well, if we're going to redo this, because there currently is like a basic rectangle garage there, if we're going to redo this, we'd like to connect to the house in the yard in different ways. So that's coming from their desire. So then we kind of come in and sort of say, well, maybe we just do a block that has your theater and has a bathroom and has the writing room upstairs, and that the architecture develops as it negotiates the house, the pool, and the garden. And so it gives us a little bit of room to sort of say like 80% of it is exactly what you would expect it to be. And 20% of it is us, on one hand, listening and hearing you, and also bringing ourselves to this project. And I don't know, I think that like we need more client work, Mark. So I'm not sure we've figured out that balance, but I think the thought is that it is the negotiation. Like Keith said, that the client is a lot more in that writer's block project than in the House of Cores project.
We have another question in the chat. Josue, would you like to unmute and ask, or would you like me to read it?
Hey, hi.
Hello.
Sure, no problem. Hi, everyone. Thank you for your lecture. Incredible work. You know, my question was regarding, or is regarding, prototyping and representation, and I think kind of like following up on Keith's sort of a question or comment in terms of the audience. So how do you prototype, or how does your work reinvent, you know, prototyping and representation? You know, I mean, I first saw your work on SCI-Arc's Instagram, you know, page.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, seeing your work also, you know, how do you incorporate the stories? I mean, how do you, it almost seems like you had to reinterpret or reinvent the sense of prototyping. And then how does the build work informs or becomes a prototype for, you know, future work? Because this final piece that you represent right here in SCI-Arc it's really nice to see how all of your previous work, it's sort of embedded in this, you know, little installation. So, hi everyone.
Awesome. Oh man, I love that question, Jose. And it's, I wish Betty could be here with us, Kelly. But I think that I don't know if I'm too literally interpreting. I guess I have two answers. One is like a literal interpretation of prototyping in terms of like fabrication and prototyping. And that is that because SCI-Arc was essentially shut down at the time, we were fully remote at the time when this project had to happen. Even though we have really robust fabrication facilities at SCI-Arc, we were not able to use them. So it sent us sort of out in the world, Jose, to kind of look for how we would prototype this project. And by prototype, it also became the actual end artifact. And we also ultimately found a fabricator down in Gardenia, California, that the primary work that they do is sort of, columns, like neoclassical columns for, houses and studio sets here in Los Angeles. And so we were like, well, when we went to meet her, I was like, well, this is kind of like a column. Like we sort of, needed to be fabricated like a column, and we were super panicked. And she saw what we wanted to do. And she's like, oh yeah, like our machines can totally do that. So essentially, they just made this. I don't know if that answers your question, if it was like prototyping in that way, but sort of we then kind of cut this thing apart into pieces that then could be kind of put back together. And so there was sort of, prototyping in that way. I think that the other way of prototyping, and then I'll let Kelly maybe answer that. The other way of prototyping is one of maybe more of a conceptual prototyping, and that would be how House of Cores, is sort of a ring that sort of holds all of these potential cores that could kind of spin off into other projects. And so in a way, that project is sort of a prototype for projects that we hope are in the waiting. And I think that's another way I think we work with prototype in the office.
Yeah, I mean, I think these types of exhibitions, I think they can either go, well, they can go many routes, but they can go the route of it's an installation or an exhibition that scales up, right? So it's a kind of one-to-one. You're working with the actual material that would either scale up or exactly kind of translate to a built scenario outside of the gallery. And we didn't see that in this project. There isn't a kind of literal translation. It's made of foam. It is coated in elastomeric paint, which is an exterior application, and it would probably hold up for a while. But we didn't really see it as a kind of object meant to explore particular materialities or structural systems that would directly scale up. Instead, I think we looked at it as kind of how I set up in the beginning, like this notion of the production of a kind of design methodology that would find its way out of the gallery through new forms of architecture. And interestingly, like when we started to design the episodes that you're seeing on the right, which is like the visual content in the, like partially what you see now is like partially white, partially blue, that those were moments where we had to kind of translate the qualities of the thing in the middle of the gallery into a kind of real architectural space that the camera could move through. And so the core that you see in the gallery is it's not extracted from a kind of pre-designed or a designed space. It is a kind of additive process rather than subtractive. We talk about it as a core sample, as a subtractive process, in the sense that we are kind of sampling qualities, but it is an additive design process. And so I think, the kind of moving image on the right for us is the beginnings of the escape velocity, I think, out of the gallery, because I think for us, we saw that as a prop in a way. It gets us the thing on the right.
Great. This is such a fun conversation, but we're drawing close to the end of our time. I really want to thank you both. It was just a great pleasure to see you speak about the work, and I'm really left with admiration for both the precision with which you develop the projects, and then the are we still live? And the precision with which you describe the work. I think it's not as common as maybe we would hope. Like with each project, like the logic of it, that the links, as you're describing in relation to Josue's question, is really exciting. And maybe like, you know, a conversation that we can have later is, you know, I'm really also interested in like emerging, or not emerging, but the sort of growing intentionality, right? With each project, I can see like your intentions becoming more precise as well, even as they become more expansive, if that makes sense at all. Maybe that's a different applications, but I want to thank you both so much for taking the time to join us here. I really wish that we could all be here together so that we continue this conversation. But thanks again, Kelly. Thank you, Kristy.
Thank you. Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. We really appreciated them and for your time tonight and the invite.
Yeah, thank you. Bye, Adam. Bye, Clark.